if I may start with a quote. Development is an inalienable right of all countries. It's the kind of thing we might hope to see coming from Western powers after 400 or so years of colonialism, but it's not. For 400 years, Western powers have developed and their colonies were held back. But that's all started to change. The G7, if I can go back in history, was started to help the 6 richest countries at the time to overcome the financial ravages of 1975. It was a difficult time. All were attempting to overcome inflation and recession. The oil crisis had hurt them and their global power had already diminished. Japan and Germany had recently lost a war, as well as their national sovereignty, to the USA. Britain, France and Italy had all lost their empires. The USA was also in the process of pulling out of Vietnam and probably still smarting from not winning in Korea only 20 years before. Individually, none of these could hold an empire together, but collectively, they could. So the G7, because Canada joined 1 year later, became an all-encompassing group aimed at furthering security, global power, and maintaining financial, political, and military leadership. Now, if you think this is nothing more than rhetoric, or is based on my personal views of the G7, let me point out just 2 statistics that might help you understand why I and many others hold this opinion. The G6 or 7 to this day represents less than 10% of the global population. In 1975, they represented 70% of global GDP. 50 years later, it's only 40% of global GDP. India and China represent 40% of the global population together, and they sit at number 2 and number 5 on the list of GDPs, but are not considered worthy of entry. China, because the ideology doesn't fit the goals of other members, and India, because although their GDP would entitle them to join, and they are recognized, albeit in name only, as a democracy, they're considered too poor to be of any use. The G7 is an exclusive club that only rich countries which toe the US line are allowed membership of. This is clear when we look at the photos that come out of their meetings. What do you notice when you see these 3 following photographs? Here's Obama with the G7 leaders. Here's Trump with the G7 leaders. And here's Biden with G7's leaders. What's noticeable is that no matter where the event is held, the US president is in the middle. You might assert that this is because they're the leading economy, but take a look at the recently released BRICS meeting photograph in South Africa. As a matter of respect, the host takes center position. So this is less about power and more about mutual respect. The quotation I opened with was spoken on the first day of the BRICS conference in Johannesburg this week by Xi Jinping. And when he says these things, he means them. Development is the inalienable right of all countries. Now, I've looked at the history of the G7 and seen it started as the G6, then added Canada. In 1998, they added Russia, but then in 2014, they removed Russia. They used the annexation of the Crimea as the reason. But the real reason is perhaps a little more simple. In 2009, Russia had mooted the idea of emerging economies which were not welcome into this elite G7 club, forming their own group. Brazil, India and China joined Russia in this informal gathering and moved into a more formal arrangement which became known as BRICS when South Africa joined. Note the G7 is made up exclusively of countries which were either colonials or settler colonies. The UK, Germany, France, Italy and Japan all had rampaged across different, or in some cases the same parts of the world, to take over places that didn't belong to them and to call them their own. Ironically, it was Russia moving into a place that others disputed, which caused them to be expelled from the colonial club. People may argue that Canada wasn't a colonial country, Then I'd ask the question, what was Canada called in 1700? It certainly wasn't called Canada. And who lived there? Certainly not the Canadians that we now know as Canadians. BRICS, on the other hand, shows the tide has turned. The 5 countries which currently make up BRICS represent 40% of the world's population. But it's a different kind of population. With the exception of Russia, all the other countries were victims of colonization. Russia was a victim of invasion. China lost Hong Kong to the British, it lost Macau to the Portuguese, but it also lost concessions in many other parts of the country. To listen to this list: Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and the USA. Of course, it lost some parts to Russia too. Brazil was Portuguese, India was led by the British, South Africa by the British, and before them, the Dutch. China now leads BRICS in terms of GDP, but does not lead the group ideologically. And in a clear indication of how times have changed, BRICS now represents 25% of global GDP, but more importantly, Brazil, India, China, and Russia all had higher than average GDP growth in both 2022 and first half of 23, while the G7 countries all experiences losses or very small increases, well below those of the 4 growing BRICS members. In other words, BRICS is growing in value while the G7 continues to shrink. The world is turning. Take a look at what's happening now. The G7 won't allow India in, they're too poor. They won't allow China in, they're ideologically unsuitable. They haven't invaded, pillaged, and they don't steal the resources of other countries. They won't allow Russia in because they say Russia does invade, pillage, and steal the resources of other countries. Since the G7's founding, the only observer country allowed has been Spain, another colonial invader. They also allow the European Union, which gives France, Germany, and Italy even more clout around the table, but still not powerful enough to overcome the USA's monopoly on decisions. But it's what's happening with BRICS in the future that is really important. And it's so important that the BBC has decided not to cover it. CNN have decided not to cover it. It's amazing that a meeting which represents 40% of the global population and 25% of global GDP doesn't get a mention on the front pages of the 2 foremost media outlets in the international community. More than 40 countries have expressed an interest in joining the 5 current members, and more than 20 have formally applied. This is not an insignificant movement. This is 20% of all the countries on Earth. Now, since it commenced in 1975, how many countries have applied to join the G7? None. Canada and the European Union, or the European Community as it was then, were invited. Russia was invited in order to prove that the West was magnanimous in its victory over the Soviet Union, but then they showed they weren't magnanimous at all by expelling Russia just 15 years later. But why are Egypt, Iran, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, in fact, over 20 countries from Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America all clamoring to join BRICS? It's simple. Because BRICS is a group where the benefits are real. Membership isn't exclusive. And as many people around the world now realize, if there is a club that lets Americans in, it's not a club they'd really want to be a member of. In fact, the G7 isn't a club at all. It's a gang. And as Xi Jinping also said on one of his many quotes, ganging up to form exclusive groups and packaging their rules as international norms are even more unacceptable. I honestly couldn't agree more with him. And I wish the members and the future members of BRICS a very successful future. And I thank you once again